Well, good evening. And the truth is that in relation to what Mama was saying,
Y la verdad que en relación con lo que estaba diciendo Manuel,
in front of us we have some smokers orcs as the terminology of that giant.
orcos infumables, como bien dice, que me encantó la terminología de ese gigante que
Which is part of the Fairer Foundation, which is Axel Kaiser says,
parásitos mentales.
and they have their heads full of all the bad crap that, for some reason,
La cabeza llena de todas las porquerías malas que por algo
the country in the last 100 years has sunk.
100 años se ha hundido como
But
solo.
despite having all that machine in front of us,
Pero a pesar de tener a toda esa máquina impedida enfrente,
I want to tell you that it becomes even easier to do everything we are doing
vuelve hasta fácil hacer todo lo que estamos haciendo.
when you are accompanied by a team of giants like the ones that accompany me.
Gigantes como el que me
So,
acompaña,
the achievement is that of each of my ministers,
de cada uno.
who are truly superstars, and the only thing I have to do is fix the course and nothing else.
Lo que tengo que hacer es fijar el rumbo.
So, my thanks to all those giants who accompany me,
También mi agradecimiento a todos esos gigantes que me acompañan.
making the best government in history. At the same time, I want to start by thanking all of you for your presence.
A su vez, quiero empezar agradeciendo a todos su presencia.
In this very important event for us,
Importante para nosotros.
the support of all of you is fundamental for the patriotic gesture that we are taking forward.
Esta patriótica que estamos llevando adelante.
Know that with your contribution, you become an indisputable part of the great transformation that we are carrying out.
Gran transformación que estamos realizando.
A year and a half ago, I asked you and the entire society to judge us for our intentions and vocations of change.
Y vocación de cambio.
Today, I ask you to renew your vote of confidence based on everything that we have already shown you.
Base a todo lo que ya les hemos demostrado.
We did not arrive at these midterm elections with loose paper promises.
Con promesas flojas de papel
We arrived with our fistful of profound changes that had never been implemented in Argentina before.
se habían implementado en la Argentina.
I will tell you something that is very interesting from a work that Manuel Adorni did.
El trabajo que hizo Manuel Adorni.
When we checked the networks, people said, "This is more than I voted."
Esto es más de lo que voté.
And then, one of the things that occurred to us was, why don't we make a track record of the things we are doing?
¿Por qué no hacemos un track record de las cosas que estamos
Because if there is something that has characterized Argentinian politics, it is that politicians are liars.
caracterizado la política argentina es que los políticos son unos
In fact, they are liars because we are the outsiders.
siguen siendo, o sea, porque nosotros somos los outsiders.
And we are outsiders even though we are in power. That is, we have not lost our spirits.
Hemos perdido el espíritu.
And then I asked Manuel to make a track record of our campaign promises, how much had been fulfilled.
Y entonces le pedí a Manuel que hiciéramos un track record de nuestras promesas de campaña, cuánto había sido cumplido.
1 year had been fulfilled in management, and we found it interesting to check that,
Nos parecía interesante chequear eso.
especially because they said that each of the things that we promised was impossible
Era imposible.
and that they could not be done.
Podían hacer.
And that basically we had a delirious program that nothing of what we said could be done.
Lo que decíamos se podía hacer. Bueno,
So, the logical or normal thing would have been that in 25% of the time, if we were fulfilling the nearly, we would have to have fulfilled 25% of the promises.
digamos, si estuviéramos cumpliendo linealmente, tendríamos que haber cumplido el 25% de las promesas.
And the most interesting thing is that when we began to make that track record, we began to notice that we were not only fulfilling the promises,
Empezamos a hacer ese track record, lo que empezamos a notar que no solo que estábamos
but
cumpliendo,
we were doing things that we had not promised that we were going to do, and we were also doing them.
y también las estábamos haciendo.
And when we finished making the numbers, we had discovered that we have fulfilled 98% of our promises,
Hemos descubierto que habíamos cumplido con el 98% de nuestras promesas.
and that strictly, the only thing that was missing was to open the net,
Lo único que faltaba era abrir el cepo.
a thing that we already did. That is, we are also the first government in history that also fulfills with each of the promises we made. So we are the king of delivery.
El rey del delivery.
In turn, it is worth mentioning, right?
A su vez, digamos, vale la pena mencionar, ¿no?
Because we have taken the reins of a state in ruins that combine the worst components of the last three major crises we have experienced.
Últimas grandes crisis que vivimos,
That is the monetary imbalance of the Roger Go, the famous money overhang.
el famoso money over,
Yes, a balance of the broken central bank worse than the previous one of 89.
digamos, peor que la previa del 89,
And also worse social indicators than that of 2001,
lo del 2001, con lo
with which we were at the gates of the worst crisis in Argentine history without a doubt.
lugar a dudas.
And thanks to the joint work of our entire management team,
Equipo de gestión,
we managed to get past the brink of hyperinflation,
inflación,
to discuss whether we arrive at the end of the year with an inflation that begins with 1 or 0.
cero.
And next year, as I have already said, inflation will be just a memory of the past. Here I am going to tell you something about the internal, in the positive sense, please.
De la interna, digamos, pero en el sentido positivo, por favor.
As you all know, both Toto and I are very vulnerable to risk.
Toto, como yo, somos personas muy aversas a
So our hypothesis is that inflation is going to die in the middle of next year.
morir a mitad del año que viene. Pero
But our colossus, let's say the giant feather coasters said no, it's going to be before that.
va a ser antes.
And the first surprise we have now in May with an inflation of 1.5.
Del 1,5, cuando
Do you remember that we left the CIPCO? No, that inflation is going to station between 5 and 7 and they are not going to lower it anymore.
del imbécil
Not to mention the idiots who said that this made a U-turn and it went up.
tremendamente, ¿no?
Interesting, because 1.5 in consumer, in wholesale, deflation after 17 years.
Minoristas, en mayoristas, deflación después de 17 años. Y entonces,
So Federico said that we could arrive at the end of the year with 0.
un año ya con cero.
And this I think we are going to have to lease the bet, Toto and I.
La apuesta Toto y a mí. Y
And I said that when the inflation was at 0, there is going to be a concert. I warn you that I am already beginning to rehearse Six Sons. Even more, we are achieving all this, returning the path of growth,
tomando el sendero del crecimiento,
and starting the year with a quarterly growth of 0.8.
8,
And that compared to the previous quarter, but 5.8 in year-to-year terms,
anual,
even with the uncertainty that the agreement with the fund brought during this period.
fondo.
As if all this were not enough, we finished with the stumbling blocks in the city of Buenos Aires, and we carried out 2,500 reforms so that the state stops getting in the way of the Argentines. This is also very interesting because today in the world we talk
Que hoy en el mundo se habla
about the expansionary adjustment. That is, we have given a class of macroeconomics applied worldwide,
aplicada a nivel mundial
making a fiscal adjustment that between the Treasury and the central bank
que entre el Tesoro y el Banco Central
reaches 15 points of the GDP, and while everyone was predicting a cataclysm,
el mundo andaba pronosticando un cataclismo,
I have not forgotten any of the 200 local economists
200 economistas locales
but that everyone left their fingers marked saying that what I proposed was a complete delirium.
diciendo que lo que yo proponía era todo un delirio.
So we can go and look for that list and tell them.
Esa lista y decirles
And the internationalists who said that it was a complete disaster.
que dijeron que era todo un disparate.
Not only did we make the adjustment, we took the inflation, but also last year the GDP measured by the ME,
El PBI medido por el
that is a monthly estimator of the economic activity.
económica
In comparison, December against December, were 6%.
subió 6%.
The first quarter of this year has given 6%,
El año ha dado 6%.
and during this quarter the economy has been expanding by 8%.
La economía se viene expandiendo a
We are touching the historical maximums of GDP and consumption.
históricos de PBI, de consumo.
well worth each of them the phrase of Maradona.
Vale a cada uno de ellos la frase de Maradona.
In just a year and a half of our management,
Solo un año y medio de nuestra
we then went from a wholesale inflation of 54% per month, which is annualized from 17,000, whose annualized value would have implied a hyperinflation capable of erasing all wealth that exists in this country, to a deflation of 0.3% in May, its lowest value in 17 years.
su menor valor en 17 años.
And now we are arguing if the consumer inflation of 1.5% is too much or too little.
Es mucho o poco.
Go if we are not doing things right.
Estaremos haciendo las cosas bien,
If the previous Minister of Economy crossed his fingers, taking for an inflation that would start with 3, while printing 13 points from the GDP to win an election.
ganar una elección.
In fact, it is at the time change that in just 18 months,
De época que tan solo 18
we achieved that inflation ceases to be the main concern of Argentine families. When you look at Argentine concerns,
preocupaciones argentinas
when we reached the peak, there was inflation and insecurity.
estaba la inflación y la inseguridad
And all those numbers are falling.
derrumbando.
In fact, inflation has become 6th or 7th place,
Sexto o séptimo lugar.
and insecurity still has important places,
Todavía tiene lugares importantes.
because people did not realizing that, for example,
La gente no termina de darse cuenta que, por ejemplo,
the bloodbath in the province of Buenos Aires
provincia de Buenos
is the fault of Kicillof, not ours.
nuestro
But we also have to be honest.
tiene que ser, digamos,
With the tons of money that it pays,
toneladas de pauta que
it is
paga,
difficult for the rich to see reality.
a los ensobrados les cuesta mostrar la realidad.
And if that were not enough, we also managed to maintain the level of activity by functioning with a monthly economic activity estimator about its maximum values, with indicators of private consumption and maximum historical values, and with sectors flying statistically, such as the real estate sector, which comes in record after record of the production of oil that does not find a roof and has been growing above 10% annually, which is the highest in the world. Thank you, Horacio Marin, for your enormous speech on the WIPIA.
En más de 20 años. Gracias, Horacio Marín, por
To have a more concrete overview of where our government is standing and where the opposition is standing with respect to the economy. Opponents are running us down with the fact that non-profit imports are not able to reach the market, and we have to take a step forward. But the reality is that 70% of said imports are capital goods, accessories, protective supplies, and raw materials to capitalize our local protection and increase competitiveness. Here I also want to make a note of color. I don't know if it is a good idea, but I want to make a note of color, and I want to make a note of color because I think it is a good idea, I don't know if, sometimes I tell them, it's hard for me to believe that economists are so rude. I mean, because now they are with the discussion of a current account, and that the current account. I'm sorry that I'm going to make a theoretical digression, but I think it's worth it. Free
nosotros
House
hemos
talked
hablado hasta
to the point of exhaustion
de nuestro marco.
about our conceptual framework. We always talk
Siempre hablamos que
that we work with models
modelos de equilibrio
of general and intertemporal balance, a way
una forma
to
de
simplify it
simplificarlo y de verlo
and to see it quite
simple, digamos,
simple
es pensarlo
is to think about the models.
a la VIX.
Here we have
Tenemos a nuestro
our great economist from the Faro Foundation, Adran Ribia. You, in fact, could teach this much better than me. And great note on public television. I are going to start calling you. Now it's very complicated.
Eh,
And then,
y entonces
what you have
que tienen
in those analytical frameworks
analíticos
is what is called
es lo que se
the savings investment schemes,
llama
where the interaction between savings and investment determine the interest rate, which is
un mecanismo.
an intertemporal coordination mechanism.
Es más,
In fact, the interest rate is the relative price of the present goods with respect to the future goods. So why does savings rises when the interest rate rises? Because savings is neither more nor less than future consumption. So if the interest rate rises, it means that the present goods are becoming less relative to the future goods. Therefore, he substitutes present consumption in favor of future consumption. That's why when the interest rate rises, savings rises. On the other hand, here there are several gentlemen who are dedicated to creating wealth, or who are dedicated to making money, which is fabulous. That means they've been successful in serving the future with goods of better quality and price. They are social benefactors. Therefore, the more money they make, the better. And why? Why does the interest rate drop on the interest rate drops? Because if the interest rate dropped, it means that future prices are rising with respect to the present goods. Therefore, where are you going to sell? Where they sell cheaper or where they sell more expensive? I'm not going to explain it to you. You are going to sell more in the future. And how is that done? By transferring production from the present to the future. Well, that's called investment. Investment determines the interest rate, the real interest rate. It is the true mechanism of intertemporal coordination. Now, but that's a closed economy. What happened when you have an open economy? Well, not necessarily. The internal balance has to coincide with the external balance. That is, we came from an economy where we basically did everything run. So, we had a rate of interest with a country risk of 3,000. So clearly, that rate was above the internal balance. And as a result of this, it was generated. It exceeded the current account because the savings were greater than the investment. The problem is that savings, the Argentines, were running away, escaping the Piro and Bindois. On top of that, with a government that basically held the exchange rate artificially, which emitted money like a beast. Now, what happens? We, having made the tax adjustment, the point is that by making the deficit zero, Argentina is guaranteed the condition of intertemporal solvency, that is, the debt-product relationship in Argentina, is decreasing. In fact, in the last year, the one that is free of the public sector went from levels of almost 100% to 40%. That is, Argentina is intertemporal solvent. And the opposite of that is that the country risk was lowered. So if the rate of interest of international arbitration falls below the domestic balance or the internal balance, the consequence is that there is going to be more investment than savings. When there is more investment in savings, it is a countable identity. There's a current account deficit. That is, there is no problem in having a current account deficit, because the current account deficit is an excess of investment over savings. It can be viewed in different ways. Clearly, if you have tax deficit and current account deficit, you have a problem. What does it depend on? It is crucial that you finance it from the outside, and the day you cut the financing, it flies through the air. Now, the other alternative is that you have current account deficit, because the investment expands. What is happening? The latest data of investment went up 32%. So, when you look at the increase in employment, 70% is linked to expanding production. It is linked to investment. So there's no problem, because there is also no tax deficit. It is not that the state is consuming savings. In fact, we gave back to the private sector 15 points of the GDP. Therefore, they are getting scared. And then, when you take cases of strong economic growth, the essential characteristic of his processes is that you also generate current account deficit because you are generating a lot of growth. Or I ask you a question, he come to a business opportunity and say, no, well, I'm going to wait. When you do that, you're going to have to pay a lot of money. So it is natural that in the face of the interest rate years, you perceive them as permanent and most likely they're going to invest and generate that phenomenon. Therefore, I warn you because I don't know if economists see this out of brute force or perhaps both things at the same time. I say because part of the cast is also the functional professionals of the state party. And the truth is that all this we achieved against wind and tide. We achieved it despite the extortion of the packets, despite the fact that 24/7 in the media operated with lies, slanders, despite the fact that they systematically tried to knock us down, and even despite their constant attempts to destitution, we achieved it with only 15% of the deputies and 10% of the senators, some heroes who stood up against the machine to prevent. And in that sense, I also want to mention Panda. It's not here. I didn't see it. It didn't come. It's the great work of that we have as head and cabinet, which is Guillermo Sanca. Because very interesting things happen throughout the management process. And it's that when we started, it was as if things were half balanced. There were pigeons. Well, one escaped. Rome does not pay traitors. Then there were the hawks, and there are two Taliban. Well, today almost all the cabinet is Talibanized. So that implies that Guillermo has to work extra as a consequence. So we are all happy, Talibanized. So my thanks to Guillermo, which is the fundamental connection between the Taliban and politics, and also the work of Martin Menem, my sister Karina, and the giant Santiago Caputo. That's why our model has already won, because it showed that with political war what seems impossible is possible. I often say that politics for us is not the art of the possible, it is the art of making possible what the cast says impossible. And we also win because we demonstrate to the adversaries that the law of gravity is the law of gravity, although they try to deny it. Again, I recommend emphatically the work of Axel Kaiser, Mental Parasites, because it has no waste. As we always say, and we will continue to say, we prefer to say uncomfortable truths to comforting lies, and we never promised that the way would be easy, but rather that it was the right way. What we have shown to the whole world during this first half of our management is nothing but a miracle, the great Argentine miracle. We are the repeating student who is already fed up with hyperinflation and the destruction of his own currency, decided to do the task properly and ended up being today a world example. Although we know that this miracle is nothing more than the first step, today having punished the ghost of the head inflation of the Argentines. We are in the middle of the faculty to start solving the rest of the worrying problems that previous management has left us. The state is calamitous and requires urgent reforms in each of its areas. For this, it is imperative to accumulate political power we wish to challenge the casta universe of privileges that have been built within the law and outside it. And if the law was not there, they did it so that they could continue to have privileges. A nice sample that they gave us in the province of Buenos Aires. That's why this, rather than being a marathon in which we will gain rid the manner and whose results we will notice more deeply with the course of the months and years in each of the elections, that we have ahead, know that this is just beginning. That is why I want to emphasize the midterm elections to come, and in particular in the elections of the province of Buenos Aires, which are even closer. For the first time in the recent history of our country, the model of freedom is being presented on a large scale in legislative terms. In these elections, the depth and the speed of change that we will carry out will be defined, and in front we us, the entire status quo standing behind the privileges that they do not want to lose. Let's not be fooled. We can make profound changes to the national public administration, but the provinces explain an important part of the public spending and the suffocating regulatory pressure that the private sector faces. Without going too far, a year ago, a large part of the governors signed the May Pact, where they agreed to reduce public spending to 25 points of the GDP, but none of them made the appropriate adjustment in their jurisdiction, disrespecting society they say they represent. This is why it is imperative to bring change to the provinces, given that it will exponentially accelerate the process of growth that we will experience in the coming years, deepening the roots of the tree of the new Argentina we are sowing together. It is thus that today the province is the last trench that the political guest has found the guard and continue squeezing the pockets of the country. And this is the best example of how, from the local power, some seek to boycott the national change. Not only did they not care about the general clamor of the entire country asking to shrink the state, but in their fatal arrogance, they dedicated themselves to increasing it, using the Monero schedule as an unlimited checker to take them against. If we said we wanted to sell airlines, they would buy them. If we proposed to close the Inca, they would close and create a provincial one. That is, they no longer even intended to base themselves on logic, but by default they reacted to our actions as if their minds had been taken by parasites that deprived them of all reason, that is, the mental parasites. In fact, they were so infected that they became those who accused the guerrillas of opposing everything the adversary does. Thus they demonstrated to have no other agenda than the irrational defense of the interests of the caste interests in open opposition to the rest of the good Argentinians. And that is why, clearly, we call them mandros, because we are also winning. That is why we call them mandros. Not content with propagandizing through an official agenda to all the newspapers, magazines, radio programs, and television in the country, they squeeze the hip pocket of the boners to create dozens of streaming channels without any audience. They are just as wonderful. The amount of stupidity, they say, has no name. Thank you. Look, there's one now. I will tell you because it seems so funny to me. There is an idiot who, for example, in a stream said that inflation was produced by hair clippers. Look, I've heard stupidity like multi-causal inflation, structural inflation. I've heard a lot of things. I had never heard that one. That inflation was produced by hair clippers. Of course, after that person in the networks they hit him with a bold soap opera, and then he cried, but also with such stupidity that you want to give him a prize. So let's not despise the streamers, because the truth is that they allow us to have fun. Besides, it's great. For example, today we're viewing the networks a little bit because he saw that I love doing that monitoring. And how interesting. Today, a journalist confessed that at the request of another journalist who handled the program, they were dedicated to pursuing me. It was mine. Four-legged children. That is the clear demonstration of real malice. So, another one that is going to be said. Well, the truth is that this is done in an unexpected attempt to reverse the deep changes that we are doing, because they know that this is their last chance. They know that as they continue to consider our model, the future will be better than the present and the past. The people will understand the magnitude of the deception in which they live and directed the anger towards them, as I already did in 2023. Because if at that time you felt that we were not libertarians, but libertarians, and that our ideas could not be realized in reality, today the situation is very different. Today we have already won in the field of ideas, and even our adversaries know that we were right all this time, although they cannot say it out loud, because it would be to confess that they lied and they stole from people all these years. Neither they nor the rest of the world can believe that we have knocked down three great myths in economic policy, which were described by my great minister, the Colossus Federico Stoisnega. Basically, many times they call Federico, and they tell him, well, I have to make an adjustment. Nothing, and Federico tells him, well, how much do you have to do? Well, 4 or 5 points to GDP, and how are you going to do it? Well, 1 point per year. And then Federico tells him, and what if he to 5 in a month? No, that's impossible. No, well, that's what Javier did. So the first myth that we have knocked down in times of tax adjustment is the magnitude. That also relates the quantum and the time. In fact, we made a reduction in the public spending of 30%. And Federico asked his team to investigate how many times since 1940. Here are statistics. Let's say Hamusius. In the background, how many times something like this had happened, and only something like this happened in 24 opportunities. But the interesting thing is that in the 24 opportunities that they happened, it was done after a war. If you clean the effector, the bourgeois, the only ones who did that worse, and it's a fallout. Were not enough also, because that was 5 points. The GDP, we also adjusted 10 in the central bank. So I'm also proud that we have made the biggest tax adjustment in all the history of humanity. The second point that Federico also point out, if I'm not mistaken, the first time he made this Federico argument was at the Federation of Federalism and Freedom in a conference in Chiquiman. He says, then he repeated it in the background. And besides, I saw him in Poparo because he does marketing for when I have to make a living again in the private sector when Imlei's best position. I'm not talking about River Davy because I don't use it. And in that context, when you look at what you are saying, that we were going to sink the economy into a recession. In fact, adjustments of the half of what we did have generated falls of the 15% product. Therefore, they predicted that we were going to put the economy in a great depression, and as I was telling you a while ago, in 2024 we finished 6% up. This first 2023 in December to December in the demilitarized to me in the first quarter, expanding to 6%, in the second expanding to 8%. So we have also destroyed the mesa. If we adjusted, we were going to go to a terrible recession. Not only that, but the low inflation and the recovery of the economic activity and the enormous task of the Minister Sandra Petrevalo basically made the poverty jump from 57%, when we measure it honestly, to 35%. That is to say, a heartless labros lowered the poverty rate 22 percentage points. That is to say, we also pulled 10 million people out of poverty. In addition, there are many people who were surprised by the popular support we have. And the reality is that not only, let's say, is what we did in terms of inflation, what we did in terms of social policy, but there is also another policy that is strongly through poor, which is the enormous task that Minister Patricia Boris is carrying out as the Ministry of Security, because those of us who are lucky to be better off, we can have private security, we can be in more guarded places. The security, the problems of insecurity, where they hit harder is in those who have less, and those who cannot afford private security, who cannot live in a gated neighborhood, or things like that. That is why we are so popular among the most vulnerable sectors, because we lowered inflation, because we solved goblins, because also, not only that, but real wages have been rising systematically for more than a year, but we also lowered insecurity. Today we are the safest country in Latin America, and we are one of the best countries in the World Peace Ranking, thanks to the enormous work that the Minister Boric is doing. So it is, you will see, it is very easy to be president with all these monsters in my team. And the third, that we destroyed, is that the dream is unpopular. Today, the levels of image, both in what has to do with my personal image or what has to do with management, we are at levels similar to those we had when we started the government. And not only that, we are in condition to give a tremendous attack now in September in the province of Buenos Aires, and in October in the whole country. That is to say, not only that we have invented the passive adjustment, but we have also invented the popular adjustment. This is interesting. In fact, I don't remember if it was yesterday or before yesterday, I had a meeting with an interviewer, and he had just done a program on the tax policy, and it is incredible because this is the most valuable of all. Let's say our policy of adjustment and tax austerity are hyper-popular. So while the garbage, the filthy rats, their co-workers, my ex-co-workers, let's say, want to break us, the tax result with demagogic policies, what they don't realize is that they can
podrán
to lay a little
retrasar un poco
the pace at which we
el ritmo al que nos
spread because they make us raise the country's risk, but the people are going to punish them at the polls. That is, people understood that adjusting the tax is returning the money to people, and people are better off. Cruelty, yes, I am cruel. I am cruel. I am cruel with you, with the spenders, with the public employees, with the status, with those who break the ass of good Argentinians. Very well. And in that sense, as I pointed out before, the first myth took us only a month to knock it down. The second myth took us a little less than a year. And the third myth, we are making it into pieces during our second year, is that all the provincial governments have folded the elections. The harm is, and the Acme bomb is exploding over and over again. And that is why they're playing a plenum in the next elections. They be here, like a rabid animal that needs desperately to block the changes at the national level to continue subsisting. However, for example, the image of the Soviet, of the Governor Kichilov, few in a manhunt, turned the province into a jungle. Without law does not stop falling. There is no turning back. The truth always triumphs over the lie. Thanks here. All of this was also done, ignoring in the process a first fundamental law of the economy. This is great. This is said by Thomas Sherrill, a wonderful phrase. He says the first law of the economy is scarcity. That is, there is not everything for everyone. The first law of politics. That of that right? Ignoring the first law of the economy and following in line the model of the castes, they also increased the preeminent plan of obedient militants, and they dedicated themselves to thickening the GC boxes like gender policies, which the only problem they solved is the economic passing of the friends of power. This is how we began to dismantle the web of taxes and cross-border subsidies that caught the Argentine population, that under a simulation of benefits ended up hurting in a much deeper way. It is necessary to do the same in Buenos Aires, where every day there are more regulations and more taxes intended for me to sell this war without reason against the reforms of the national state. Here I also want to mention something very important, with the seriousness that our armador in the province of Buenos Aires, Sebastián Peja, and the enormous work that the expert professor is doing silently, let's say, trying with each of the ministers to go and take to the province of Buenos Aires and the remaining provinces, for example, like Cassandra Castellan and Tucumán, to take to each province the model that we are applying at the national level, to take it to the provincial level, with which, let's bet on this, because let's imagine that if, in addition to doing it at the national level, we do it at the provincial level, or at the municipal level, as for example, the Venezuela is doing in February 3, do not have doubts that Argentina, in 40 years, will be a first world power. Therefore, as I mentioned, it is necessary to do the same in Buenos Aires, where every day there are more regulations and more taxes destined only to sell this war for no reason against the reforms of the national state. The chronic deficit perpetuated by this various model is that, sooner than later, the impact in the private sector at the more than 2,500 reforms that we have carried out for a nation, the efforts of the national state to get out of the way of the profitability of the private sector so that they can achieve competitiveness, reinvest and improve its prices to the public. It is neutralized, and in its place comes another state to impose I force in the gap that is free. That is the real cost of having a degenerated fiscal power. It is not the only one. The Soviet Union is not the only one. But it is one of the two that is most concerning, and that is why we urgently need to bring the changer to a province that has decades of economic lag in its development because of almost 40 years of Penist government. Just to give a concrete example, Kisilov has been not adhered to the reggae for approximately a year, giving the Bonaerenses great investments with their consequent generation of employment and impact on real wages. What kind of governor is the one who opposes having more work in his province? We have the answer, one that does not govern for the people and only governs for state parasites. Bringing change to the province of Buenos Aires is one of the biggest priorities of our party. I think it should be a priority for everyone who wants to see Argentina prosper and leave behind the century of humiliation that Kisilov, either because of his friends or because of his political idols, his great mentors, subdued us as much as our parents, our children, and our grandparents. It is necessary to avoid that the productive engine of the nation, a province with so much power, with so much natural resources, and with so much human capital, should be systematically repressed, while the rest of the country moves forward. It is inhumane for a group of shameless people to continue subjecting the Bonaerenses to the worst of the punishments, the poverty generated from the same state. We want to return dignity to the province, and we will not rest until we achieve it. Do not be confused. In this election, we saw two models, the model of freedom and the model of caste. We are not facing a normal scenario in which differences of degrees cannot be distinguished, in which nuances can be found. We are facing an organized adversary with the sole objective that the state serves them exclusively and not the citizens, who demonstrated in 2023 to be capable of everything in order to remain in power. For example, to emit money through 13 points of GDP. And as we always say, only the well-organized can beat the poorly organized. We demonstrated to be the only political force with courage, waste and indecision to confront this impoverishing and criminal model. We suddenly cut off the Gordian knot of the corrupt part. We destroyed, without a doubt, the uncontrolled spending. In our first month of management, something unprecedented, a financial surplus, without entering into default, from which we managed to rebuild the economy and get out of the swamp, having a floating exchange with deregulation and social care-free. That is why those who accuse us of crazy or improvised policing are completely wrong. Never a political path was so sensible. We did what we had to do, and the results are accompanying us. We are facing a unique and probably unrepeatable opportunity. That is why we have invited again and again those who want to be part of the change to join us. But know that taking away our strength is not an option. It only serves to give it to the caste. The terrain of the province is not easy for us. It is a fairly hostile terrain. It is a field that for years our adversaries have planted with trenches and mines of all kinds, with the sole purpose of protecting their privileges. However, we are used to playing as visitors. Freedom advances as a political force, formed in the heat of disadvantage. That is why for us, retreating from the difficulties is not an option. In the same way we did in the nation, we will have to fight in the province against Kisilov and his legal intendants to bring the cities freedom to a citizen who needs them urgently. That is why the support of each of you gives us the supplies and the necessary to us to carry out this decisive battle. In this and in all the terrain where we will continue to demonstrate that one that duties are done when the state is shrunk and the private sector is destroyed, there is nothing more popular than taking the crack of the thousand tentacles. After years of exhaustion and impoverishment caused by decades of fiscal slavery, people are desperate for an alternative for a genuine change that allows them to grow again in them future, that makes them know that their children will have a better life than them. We are the change, and again we thank you support to carry it forward. May God bless the Argentinians. May God bless you all. May forces of heaven be with us. Long life, freedom, Roger. Thank you very much.